One night, I skipped my theology classes and went to the beach in Florida. I walked across the sand until I was alone. The foamy ocean surf brushed the sandy shore like a cat licking its wounds. It sounded like Velcro being torn apart. I watched the last rays of sunlight fall below the deep waters. My life was changing, and there was nothing I could do to fix it. The next day, my parents rushed me home on a flight so that I could be there before the end. I was shocked at the state my dad was in. I had visited him only a couple of months earlier, but was now alarmed at how his skin dipped into his temples. So little of him was left. His chest and leg bones jutted out underneath his loose skin like a skeleton underneath a blanket of skin. I remember my last moments with my dad. He held me one last time and told me he loved me. I held him when he died. Suffering is hard to talk about. Some people say it's impolite to do so, and others want to compete to see who has suffered the most. However, the core reason suffering is hard to discuss is that it is an intimately personal and sometimes isolating experience. We all have images, feelings, and memories that are challenging to share fully with others. Each of us carries the weight of our losses: the death of a parent, the end of a marriage, a friend's betrayal. These wounds leave scars on our hearts. Remember a time when you felt that sadness, anger, or sense of injustice? We have all been there. The question filling my mind was, why must there be so much suffering? Some people say God has a plan for all of our suffering, but as I watched my father's painful death and my family's agony, and as I listened to friends and acquaintances share their experiences of abuse, torture, and isolation, I wondered if this amount and intensity of suffering was necessary for some bigger plan. For example, how does a Christian like yourself justify parasites infecting babies, the abuse of the helpless, or the isolated, painful death of animals in nature? We are caught trying to balance the devastating existence of evil and suffering with the loving goodness of God. Let's think through this problem together. My name is Ryan Wellington. I'm a published theologian and philosopher, and in this video, I offer some unique answers to the problem of evil. But before considering these solutions, let's better understand suffering by thinking about the tension between our faith and the realities we experience from three clear points. 1. A loving and good God would do everything he could to prevent needless suffering. 2. An all-knowing God would be aware of evil and teach moral lessons involving minimal suffering, assuming suffering is necessary for moral teaching. 3. An almighty God would prevent much of today's suffering. So, how could the Christian God be good, all-knowing, and almighty in the face of so much evil? In my philosophy graduate studies, I evaluated many of the best philosophers and theologians on the problem of suffering in the face of a good God. Before introducing three unique ideas later in this video, I will summarize four primary explanations to help you understand my perspective. The first is sometimes called the free will defense, which argues that God allows evil as a necessary consequence of human free will. God desires a world filled with moral goodness, but this requires creating beings with the freedom to choose, including the freedom to choose evil. Here, a world with free creatures capable of moral good is inherently more valuable than a world without free will, even if this freedom permits the possibility of moral evil. The second argument is that suffering provides the opportunity for soul-making. Soul-making means that facing challenges from evil is necessary to develop virtues. Essentially, experiencing and witnessing suffering builds our character to become better people. The third is that our experiences of evil are meant to humble us and redeem us for the afterlife. A good God will want to save us humans from hell and bring us to heaven. However, God cannot directly fix our propensity to commit evil without violating our free will. Instead, we must freely choose to have God fix our will. Evil, from our choices and existing apart from us in nature, plays a crucial role in this process by humbling us, making us aware of our evil, and leading us to seek God's help. Therefore, suffering is meant to humble and redeem us, as, in Genesis, evil is a product of the fall of mankind. We are meant to become more than good. We are meant to become holy. Finally, the fourth argument is that needless suffering is not evidence against the existence of a good and all-powerful God, but that our limited cognitive abilities make it unreasonable to expect to see, without help, the purpose behind suffering, even if it exists. Due to our cognitive and evidential limitations, we cannot know how things will turn out for us. Therefore, we cannot reasonably claim that evil has no purpose without appealing to ignorance. Each of these arguments addresses much of the evil in the world. Creating a world with humans capable of moral excellence implies our freedom to create evil and its consequences. These consequences humble us and build our character. For some, this means that even the suffering of animals is meant to humble us and help us recognize the gravity of our choices. But explaining the existence of evil and explaining its overwhelming volume are separate topics. So why must there be so much evil? I offer 3 unique answers to this question. The first is philosophical and based on my interaction with the philosophy students I taught at university. I conducted a thought experiment with them and asked them to answer the following question with honesty. Imagine with me that there were 3 ancient Greek kings. Each king was great, but the question is, which king was greatest? Consider the first king. He was so great that no one dared oppose him. He had no enemies in his realm or the surrounding areas. Whenever anyone considered opposing him, they were reminded of how powerful and virtuous he was. So all attempts at opposing the king were stopped voluntarily before they began. No one wanted to resist him. Consider the second king, who was so great that he had many enemies all around him, but always conquered them. No matter how great his foes were, he always outmaneuvered them politically or militarily. Impressive powers rose against him repeatedly, but his will was unconquerable. Nothing could defeat him. Now consider the third king. He was so great that he faced many adversaries of astounding numbers and hostility. Rather than conquering with force, he chose persuasion. At first, the king's enemies were united in their opposition, poised to overcome him. However, a remarkable transformation occurred as the king persisted in his persuasion. His foes abandoned their antagonism one by one and ultimately aligned with the king's rule. Thus, the very forces that sought his destruction became the agents of his triumph. Each converted to his purposes. My philosophy students thought the third king was the greatest of the 3 because it was better to be surrounded by enemies, but eventually convert them to his side. They thought a greater king should face much opposition and many enemies. The intense opposition toward the king, followed by the transformation to his purposes, made his ultimate power more impressive and good. Similarly, when Christians refer to God, they don't just mean a great God, but a God greater than they can imagine. The greatest king experienced much opposition before drawing it to his side. Should we expect something similar with God? Shouldn't we expect excessive evil in the world if the greatest and most good God exists so that he may convert it to his purposes? St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most revered medieval theologians, had a similar intuition as my philosophy students. He said, since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good. This quote suggests that there should be an overwhelming amount of evil in the world if a good God exists. But what do you think? Which king is greater in your mind? Feel free to tell me in the comments below. My second answer to suffering is psychological and more personal because this problem is highly emotional and subjective. Suffering affects each of us in unique and painful ways. I have seen some people become twisted by their pain and others grow from it. Viktor Frankl spoke about this. Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived 4 Nazi concentration camps over a 2.5-year period. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he emphasized that individuals can choose how they respond, even in dire circumstances. He provided examples of prisoners who, despite the concentration camp's brutality and dehumanization, chose to comfort others, share their meager rations, and maintain their dignity. This demonstrates that suffering does not automatically lead to moral degradation. Individuals can choose to act with compassion and integrity, even in the face of immense pain. Some of Frankl's most famous principles can be summarized as follows. Suffering ceases to be when endowed with meaning, such as through sacrifice. This meaning provides a why that empowers individuals to endure anyhow. The ability to choose one's attitude in any circumstance is the ultimate human freedom, allowing us to find meaning even in suffering. When we can no longer change our external situation, we are challenged to change ourselves, to find a why that will enable us to bear the how of our suffering. Frankl said that many of our responses to suffering are subjective and individual. Suffering, whether that of your own or others, can transform you. You can let it break you down, becoming resentful and deteriorating personally, or you can transform your suffering into something powerfully good. This hard choice is yours, not God's. As C.S. Lewis said, pain is God's megaphone, but the aftermath of suffering is also God's invitation to be transformed into something much greater and more beautiful than before. Ultimately, a meaningful, subjective solution to the problem of suffering depends on your ability to extract meaning from it. Your belief in God's goodness in the face of suffering is a function of your ability to draw meaning from it. Much evil can become much meaning. My final answer is theological. In Christian theology, God calls us to grow in moral character and virtue. However, deification is also a part of Christian theology, and it is not the development of moral virtue. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, "The only begotten Son of God, wanting to make us sharers in his divinity, assumed our nature, so that he, made man, might make men gods." That is, we are meant to participate in the divine sonship of Christ. God draws us into his divinity through our suffering, as Christ draws near to us through his suffering, and he did not deserve to suffer. Thus, suffering is a gateway for transformation. Even with the suffering we only witness, by our deification, we are meant to respond like God, helping the sufferer become something more beautiful and better than before, and through the suffering. In this sense, we become co-creators with God of our meaningful experience of the world. This is not character improvement or moral virtue development, but participation in the redemptive divine nature to which we are drawn closer. It is more active within when we redeem suffering. We are meant to become more divine. We've covered a lot of ground in this video. We began by articulating the problem of suffering in the face of an almighty, all-knowing, and lovingly good God. Next, we summarized responses by some of the wisest philosophers of our time on how free will impacts the problem of suffering. Additionally, we discussed 3 unique perspectives on why loving God might permit a vast amount of seemingly needless suffering: the greatness of God in the face of much evil, the potential for individual growth and transformation through suffering, and the theological concept of deification as participation in God's redemptive work. Suffering is a hard topic for many people, and it's hard for me too. However, the challenge of this topic is mainly emotional rather than intellectual. Suffering is real, and it is hard, and sometimes it is utterly devastating and tragic beyond words, but God is real too, and he too is beyond words. So I invite you to be open to how suffering can be transformed into something meaningful to you and those around you. Seek healing and transformation. If you enjoyed this video and you want me to make more like it, please let me know by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you for watching and interacting with this video. I hope to see you in the next one, and God bless.